World War II or in Palestine was seen as, to the British public, hey, this isn't worth it. So the Irgun understood that, and then they took advantage of that. The other thing about the Irgun is that, particularly its leader Menachem Begin, who would later become president or prime minister of Israel, they understood media. They understood how to use television, newspapers, to advance their cause. They were really the first organization that did this, and they're the first organization where their goals or their audience was outside the immediate area. What the Irgun wanted to do was influence politics in Britain. They wanted to influence politics in the United States, who were backing the creation of Israel. They wanted to influence the politics in the United Nations, who were at the time debating whether Israel should become a state. So, of the organization, of all the terrorist organizations to that time, they were really the first, not global terrorist organizations, but used global media to advance its cause. And if there's one thing you take away from this class, is that the successful terrorist understands how to use publicity and understands how to use media to bring attention to their cause. And that's exactly what this did. Their major terrorist attack, and I talked about it earlier, was the King David Hotel. The bombing killed about 90 British and Arab civilians. There's historic debate to this day whether it was an attack, but the Irgun said they called in a warning as not to kill any civilians. That warning never reached the people in Jerusalem, and that's why there was a lot of casualties. But again, the bombing of the King David Hotel brought attention to the plight of the Jewish people in Israel, and that's probably the Irgun were the first to come up with that. The other thing that the Irgun really took advantage of was that their targets were democracies, particularly in Britain. And I think this is a key point of terrorism, is that democracies are more vulnerable to terrorist activity because of things like free speech, because the people can actually have an impact on the actions of the government. And the Irgun understood this. They definitely took advantage of that aspect of British society to amplify its cause. And in the end of the day, the Irgun was successful. The British left in 1947, 1948, and Israel was granted a state of its own, primarily, again, through the activities of the Irgun. So, terrorism, and whoever says terrorism doesn't work, you can just tell them the Irgun actually used terrorist activity to advance their cause and achieve success. So that's the first case study, and the second case study I want to talk about is the FLN in Algeria. The FLN was the Algerian resistance organization to the French occupation, and the impact of the FLN very difficult to underestimate. Nelson Mandela, Yasser Arafat, they've all said that the FLN gave them the model of what to do, or how to achieve success in a political, using violence in a political manner. So you can't underestimate what the FLN did. And just to give you some background, after World War II, France was still in charge of Algeria. They not only was a colony, but it was almost a separate part of France. There was large numbers of French citizens who actually lived in Algeria. They occupied the coast, probably the nicest land in Algeria. They were on top of the social caste there, and the French were not willing to let Algeria go, because they saw it almost as an extension of the country itself. So in 1954, the FLN, after some violent activity, or some French crackdowns, the FLN came out and they started to target the French authorities in Algeria. And they did this from 1954 to 1956. And their goal, again, was to eliminate the French influence. But for those first 2 years, it wasn't going well for the FLN. The French were actually very effective in trying to tamp down the violence. They were successful. The FLN was not. So the FLN did something that other terrorist organizations to the time did not, is that they focused activity against civilians. A very deliberate tactic to just try and strike civilians. And they felt that this would actually cause France to, or cause the occupation of Algeria to be too expensive to France, and they would withdraw. They conducted attacks against French civilians in urban environments, some Algerian civilians that they believed were working with the French, and they did some pretty nasty things to these civilians. What happened was the French, what this caused is the French actually ramped up their activities against the FLN for several years, and this was actually a pretty successful event. The French were actually pretty successful at taking out the FLN. They used some very brutal tactics, interrogations, enhanced interrogations, rounding up civilians, killing civilians in the street. And this actually had a deterrent effect on the FLN, a deterrent effect on the Algerian civilians who supported them. Whoever says brutality doesn't work is wrong. In this case, the actions of the French actually did do well in defeating, or the perceiving defeat of the FLN. And the FLN was on the verge of defeat, but what happened is the tactics of the French really caused some deep fissures within the French government, particularly the French military and French society. Many of the French civilians, or the French civilians in general, were pretty abhorrent at some of the tactics that the French used against the Algerian people. The FLN was very, very successful, just like the Irgun before them, in exploiting media and exploiting and understanding their cause on the worldwide stage. So, despite being a pretty brutal group, they had an audience at the United Nations. They had an audience with President Kennedy at the time, in the 1960s, and they were able to use media to show the brutality of the French military. And by doing so, they actually caused France to leave Algeria, despite pretty much a French victory against the FLN, French military victory. So that kind of goes to show you, again, political and military, you can win on the battlefield, which the French did in Vietnam, but they really lost politically. They lost at home, and that forced de Gaulle to actually leave Algeria. So again, the FLN is another case study in success. Despite being militarily weakened, they were able to use the media arms to achieve their success. So with that being said, I just wanted to cover the history for this section. Again, case study will probably be on your midterm and final. For next week, you can see the readings in front of you. Please read them. I know the midterm will probably take priority, but afterward, if you can, try and get to the readings. I'll talk more about the midterm on the discussion boards, but again, it's going to be pretty straightforward. Nothing too much to worry about. So, with that being said, thank you for your time, and I'll see you on the discussion boards.